The narcissistic woman discards someone. The act is rarely as simple as it appears on the surface. To the outside observer, it may look like a clean break, a sudden loss of interest, or the beginning of a new chapter for her. But psychologically, the discard is often part of a much larger emotional pattern. It carries an expectation built into it, an expectation about how the other person will respond. Very often, the narcissistic discard is not meant to be the end of influence, to provoke a reaction. The individual being discarded is expected to protest, to plead, to try to explain themselves, or to fight for the relationship. Plead, to try to explain themselves, or to fight for the relationship. There may be long messages attempting to clarify misunderstandings, emotional appeals, asking for another chance, or visible pain expressed through anger, sadness, or desperation. Even resentment can serve the purpose. Because in these moments, the narcissistic individual is still receiving something extremely important, confirmation that they still matter deeply in the emotional world of the other person. Reaction is the oxygen of narcissistic dynamics. It reassures the narcissistic personality that their presence still has power, that their absence still has impact, that they are still capable of stirring emotional storms inside someone else's mind. But something very unusual happens when the reaction never comes. The person who was discarded becomes emotionally silent, not out of suppression, but out of genuine withdrawal. The entire psychological script begins to collapse. Instead of pleading, they step back. Instead of arguing, they become still. Instead of trying to repair the connection, they quietly begin to rebuild their own life. This silence is not just the absence of communication. It is the absence of emotional pursuit, and that absence creates a form of psychological dissonance. The narcissistic mind expects movement. It expects resistance, explanation, or emotional turbulence. When none of that appears, uncertainty begins to grow. Was the connection really as insignificant as she believed? Why isn't he trying to come back? Why hasn't he reacted? Silence introduces questions where there used to be certainty. What is important to understand here is that narcissistic perception often depends heavily on reflection from others. The reactions of people around them become a mirror through which they evaluate their own importance and influence. Someone reacts strongly, that mirror reflects power and significance. But when someone becomes emotionally quiet, the mirror disappears. Without that reflection, the narcissistic individual may begin to feel something unfamiliar, ambiguity. They no longer know exactly what place they occupy in the other person's emotional landscape. The absence of reaction leaves a psychological gap, and the mind often tries to fill that gap with speculation. Sometimes this speculation turns into curiosity, sometimes into irritation, sometimes even into a subtle sense of loss. Not necessarily because love has suddenly appeared, but because the expected structure of control has been disrupted. The dynamic has changed. The person who was once emotionally available for influence has stepped outside the pattern entirely. They are no longer participating in the emotional choreography that sustained the relationship before. And when someone steps out of a pattern that was once predictable, the mind naturally begins to re-examine the situation. This is often the first quiet moment when reevaluation begins, not through confrontation, not through persuasion, but through the simple power of emotional non-participation. It is a paradox that many people struggle to understand. The instinct, after being discarded, is often to fight for clarity, to demand answers, to defend one's value. But psychologically, those reactions often reinforce the very dynamic that allowed the discard to happen in the first place. Silence, when it comes from genuine emotional detachment, sends a very different message. Communicates that the relationship no longer defines the center of your inner life. And when someone realizes they no longer have the ability to provoke your emotional world, something unexpected can begin to happen inside their own. Because sometimes the moment a person stops reacting is the moment another person finally starts thinking. One of the most surprising triggers that can make a narcissistic woman reevaluate someone she has discarded is growth. Visible growth, not just growth in material terms or superficial accomplishments, but the subtle, profound transformation of someone who once appeared dependent on her approval, guidance, or emotional validation. Growth in this sense is both deeply internal and unmistakably visible to the perceptive eye. For years, the narcissistic relationship thrives on a certain dynamic. It thrives on predictability, on patterns, on roles that are clearly defined. The narcissist casts themselves as the dominant force, the judge of value, the arbiter of emotional significance. And the person being discarded often internalizes this, calibrating their sense of worth according to her perception. They adjust their behaviors, their words, even their self-perception to align with what she values, or what they imagine she values. It is a subtle form of emotional containment, and it shapes much of their identity over time. When growth emerges, it disrupts this carefully curated dynamic. Imagine someone who was once reactive to her moods, attentive to her expectations, and emotionally available on demand. When that same person begins to cultivate independence, confidence, and self-sufficiency, it creates cognitive dissonance. She has already constructed a narrative that this person is dependent, pliable, perhaps even limited in their capacity to act outside her influence. Growth challenges that narrative. It introduces a reality she had not anticipated, that the person she discarded is no longer defined by her perceptions or judgments. This cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable. The mind of a narcissist relies on certainty, the belief that influence, control, or admiration flows predictably from others. Confronted with evidence that contradicts this expectation, the narcissist experiences a subtle unease, a psychological itch that cannot be ignored. They are forced to ask, how did this happen? Who is this person now, outside of my influence? What makes this effect even more pronounced is the visibility of the growth. 10. Narcissistic individual is not just aware of internal changes. They respond to external cues, how someone carries themselves, how they interact with others, how they navigate with others, how they navigate challenges. All of these signal transformation. Growth is often contagious in perception. When others notice and respond positively, the narcissist perceives a social or emotional value shift that amplifies their curiosity. Suddenly, the person who once seemed dependent is seen thriving independently, respected by others, and increasingly unaffected by her presence or absence. This is where the reevaluation begins. TUV is not a conscious calculation in most cases. It is an automatic psychological response. The mind of the narcissist is wired to reassess potential sources of influence, competition, or social standing. When someone rises in stature, confidence, or emotional autonomy, it triggers a mental review. What have I lost? What did I misjudge? And how might this affect my position? Yet, it is crucial to understand that this reevaluation is rarely about remorse, understanding, or empathy. It is not necessarily about love in the traditional sense. It is about recalibration, reassessing someone who was once a predictable presence but is now unexpectedly autonomous and thriving. This recognition can manifest as curiosity, attention, subtle attempts to reconnect, or even strategies to reassert influence. The narcissist is trying to understand how the dynamics have changed and whether the new reality requires a response. In essence, visible growth is a mirror held up to the narcissist. A mirror that reflects their miscalculations, their assumptions, and the reality that their former control may no longer exist. It is in this reflection that the seeds of reevaluation are planted. And so, the very act of becoming whole, independent, and visibly thriving can provoke attention from someone who once discarded you. Growth is not just a personal victory. It is a subtle signal to others that the rules of the previous dynamic no longer apply. TUV lies a quiet, undeniable power, the power to exist beyond the expectations of those who once tried to define you. Another profound trigger that can spark a narcissistic woman to reevaluate someone she has discarded is the sudden absence of what psychologists call emotional supply. For many narcissistic individuals, relationships are less about mutual connection and more about the consistent reception of attention, admiration, validation, or emotional reactions. They unconsciously rely on others to provide these signals of their significance, and when that source disappears, it creates an unexpected void. To understand this, it helps to look at the mechanics of the narcissistic mind. A narcissistic personality thrives on feedback loops, tool, or overt confirmations that they are powerful, desirable, or influential. When someone is emotionally reactive, highly attentive, or constantly striving to please, it signals that the narcissist's world still revolves, in part around them. In conflict can serve this purpose. Angry outbursts, desperate attempts at reconciliation, or emotional pleading all communicate relevance. They remind the narcissist that their presence matters in someone else's internal landscape. When a person is discarded but continues to provide these emotional signals, the narcissist may feel justified in their perception that the relationship is still under their control. There is still influence. There is still response. The cycle continues. But when that supply is abruptly withdrawn, when the discarded individual becomes emotionally unavailable, detached, and indifferent, the entire framework begins to shake. This withdrawal is not merely a lack of attention. It is a sudden, undeniable demonstration that the narcissist no longer holds the same power they once did. The absence of emotional supply functions like a silent message. The person is no longer accessible, no longer defined by the narcissist's expectations, no longer available for manipulation. To the mind of the narcissist, accustomed to predictability and emotional control, is forced to take notice. The psychological impact of this absence is subtle but potent. It can manifest as confusion, curiosity, or even a mild sense of loss. The narcissist begins to wonder, why am I not being noticed? Why is she no longer responding the way she once did? What has changed? These questions are not rooted in genuine empathy or reflection, but in the sudden destabilization of a dynamic that was once predictable. What makes this effect even more compelling is the paradoxical nature of scarcity. In human psychology, value is often perceived in terms of availability. What is abundant is easily taken for granted, while what is rare is elevated in importance. The complete removal of emotional supply creates a kind of scarcity that the narcissist cannot ignore. The very act of becoming unavailable, of refusing to participate in the cycles of emotional reaction, suddenly transforms the discarded individual into someone of renewed significance. This is why so often the person who disappears quietly after being discarded can trigger a reevaluation. It is not through confrontation, persuasion, or even visible success alone. It is through the simple, profound act of being emotionally inaccessible. By stepping out of the patterns that once provided her with influence and control, the discarded person demonstrates an autonomy and resilience that commands attention. Ironically, this is the very power that narcissists often fear most. Someone who moves beyond their sphere of control. Someone whose emotional world cannot be dictated or manipulated. It is in that silence, that absence, that the narcissist begins to reconsider what was lost, and sometimes even attempts to reclaim what they can no longer take for granted. To the end, the absence of emotional supply is more than a defensive act. It is a statement of self-respect. It is a statement of self-respect. And in the quiet space of that withdrawal, the narcissist begins to see the discarded individual in a way they never could before. Whole, autonomous, and beyond their reach. Another subtle, yet powerful trigger that can lead a narcissistic woman to reevaluate someone she has discarded is the absence of bitterness. This may seem counterintuitive at first. After all, many people assume that anger, resentment, or emotional displays of hurt are the natural ways to get noticed after being discarded, but in the psychological world of the narcissist, something quite different occurs. Narcissistic thrives on predictability. When they discard someone, they expect reactions that confirm their own influence. Pleading, frustration, anger, emotional turmoil. Thief's responses validate their sense of control and reinforce the narrative they have constructed, that the discarded person is still emotionally dependent, still vulnerable, still within reach of influence. In this sense, emotional bitterness is, paradoxically, a predictable and familiar response. It maintains the patterns the narcissist understands, and it signals that the relationship continues to revolve around them. But what happens when the discarded individual reacts differently? When they process the loss internally, step back from the drama, and move forward without resentment or visible agitation? It creates cognitive dissonance in the narcissist's mind. Suddenly, the discarded person does not fit the expected script. The anger, the pleading, the attempts to reclaim attention. All of these are absent. Instead, what appears is calm, composure, and a quiet reclamation of self. This absence of bitterness challenges the narrative the narcissist constructed. They may have told themselves, consciously or unconsciously, that the person they discarded was fragile, insecure, or reactive. They may have imagined that leaving would provoke a storm of emotion. So when that storm does not materialize, the narcissist is forced to question their assumptions. This is deeply unsettling because the narcissistic mind relies on certainty and control. When expectations are not met, the sense of mastery over the situation diminishes. Moreover, the absence of bitterness can subtly signal strength. It communicates that the discarded individual is no longer defined by her actions, no longer seeking validation from her, and no longer trapped in a cycle of emotional dependency. This is a radical shift in power dynamics, where once the narcissist may have been at the center of the other person's emotional world, they now occupy a peripheral space. The calm, unresentful demeanor conveys self-sufficiency in a way that is difficult to ignore. It is important to note that this effect does not require overt confrontation or demonstration. It is not about proving success or superiority. The shift is quietly observed. The narcissist notices the absence of reaction, and that absence itself becomes significant. It disrupts the expected feedback loop and creates a psychological vacuum. In this space, curiosity arises. The narcissist begins to wonder, why is there no anger? Why is there no attempt to re-engage? What has changed in this person that I no longer hold the same power over them? This reevaluation is often subtle at first, thoughts and questions that surface in quiet moments. Yet, over time, it can lead to more active reflection and even attempts to reconnect. The very act of letting go without bitterness demonstrates a type of emotional autonomy that the narcissist cannot control, influence, or predict. And this unpredictability commands attention because it represents a domain they cannot dominate. In essence, responding without bitterness is a demonstration of inner mastery. It shows that the discarded individual is guided by their own values and emotional boundaries, rather than the whims of another. For the narcissist, this is both disarming and fascinating. They begin to see the discarded person not as a tool or an object of influence, but as someone who exists independently with a world of their own. And in that quiet, unresentful presence lies the power to provoke reflection and reevaluation, the kind that the narcissist rarely anticipates but cannot ignore. It is a reminder that the truest influence comes not from reaction, but from composed, self-contained strength. Tied up Twi factor that can trigger a narcissistic woman to reevaluate someone she has discarded is the way that individual is perceived by others. Narcissists are highly attuned to social cues, status markers, and the impressions that others form of people around them. This is not mere vanity. It is a deeply ingrained psychological mechanism. Their sense of significance is often entwined with the perceived value of those in their orbit. Test when someone they once discarded begins to earn respect, admiration, or recognition from others. It shifts the psychological landscape in ways that can provoke reflection, and sometimes even regret. When a narcissist discards someone, part of their mental framework is built on control. They assign value based on how the person conforms to their expectations or responds to their influence. They imagine that by leaving, they are asserting power, and that the discarded individual will be diminished, dependent, or reactive. When the discarded person is instead embraced, respected, or appreciated by others, it disrupts this expectation. Suddenly, the narrative that they once believed, that they are the center of the other's emotional and social world, no longer holds true. Social recognition functions as a mirror for the narcissist, reflecting a reality they cannot dictate. They observe how others treat the person they left behind, and this external validation becomes impossible to ignore. If someone is admired, respected, or sought after, it signals that the world sees them as valuable independently of the narcissist's influence. This can trigger feelings ranging from curiosity to jealousy and even a subtle sense of loss. They begin to question their judgment. Was the discard truly wise? Did they miscalculate the person's potential or significance? It is important to note that the narcissist's attention in this case is rarely motivated by genuine concern for the individual's well-being. Rather, it is an assessment of relative value, how the discarded person now occupies social or emotional space that they once expected to dominate. Their focus is on the shift in dynamics, not the person's internal growth or happiness. The admiration of others becomes a metric, a kind of social proof that challenges the narcissist's assumptions and destabilizes their sense of superiority. What makes this trigger particularly potent is the combination of independence and external validation. A narcissistic woman is unlikely to be concerned if someone has simply moved on quietly. But when that person is thriving and is being recognized by others, whether through career achievements, social influence, or the admiration of peers, it signals that the discarded individual is not only independent, but valued in ways that cannot be controlled. Material, don't recognize. At first, in the next, this perception introduces a sense of scarcity. The person is no longer available for influence, and their social value is evident to everyone except the narcissist themselves. In response, the narcissist often begins to reevaluate. They may try to understand the change, to identify what they overlooked, and to calculate whether this shift alters the dynamics in their favor or against them. Curiosity can turn into subtle attempts at re-engagement, testing boundaries, or reclaiming attention. Even the smallest acknowledgement from the narcissist, whether a casual comment, an indirect message, or a renewed focus on your life, signals the start of this mental recalibration. Ultimately, this effect underscores a profound psychological truth. Perception matters. The way others value you communicates a reality that a narcissist cannot easily ignore. External recognition serves as both mirror and metric, reflecting the strength, independence, and influence of someone who was once discarded. It is in this recognition that the seeds of reevaluation are sown. The lesson here is clear. The presence of respect, admiration, and validation from others is not superficial. It is a powerful form of psychological leverage, one that highlights your growth, autonomy, and value. And when the narcissist notices it, they are compelled to reconsider everything they assumed about you, because what others see can challenge even the most entrenched illusions of control. Another trigger that can prompt a narcissistic woman to reevaluate someone she has discarded is the undeniable sense of self-possession the individual displays after leaving the relationship. Self-possession is subtle, yet it radiates in ways that are impossible to ignore. It is the quality of being entirely centered in one's own life, decisions, and emotional world, a state where one is no longer defined by another's approval, attention, or whims. For a narcissist who thrives on influence and emotional control, this can be profoundly destabilizing. In relationships with narcissistic personalities, the dynamic is often unequal. The narcissist exerts control through subtle manipulation, charm, and emotional leverage, while the partner's sense of identity may gradually align with their expectations. The discarded person may have once been highly reactive to the narcissist, seeking validation or trying to meet their demands. But when someone emerges from that dynamic with self-possession, the balance of power shifts in ways the narcissist did not anticipate. Self-possession is not about arrogance or defiance. It is not about making statements to provoke envy or jealousy. It is simply the natural outcome of internal alignment, living in accordance with one's values, exercising agency, and no longer reacting to the expectations of someone who once sought to control them. This form of autonomy creates a subtle magnetic resonance. The narcissist senses it immediately, even if they cannot articulate exactly why. Something about this person is different. They are whole, centered, and untouchable by past manipulations. From the narcissist's perspective, this is disorienting. They are accustomed to predictability and emotional responsiveness. They are used to a world in which their desires, moods, and judgments shake the behavior of those around them. Confronted with self-possession, they encounter a boundary that cannot be crossed, a domain they cannot infiltrate or influence. This is where reevaluation begins. The narcissist begins to ask, who is this person now? How did they reach this state of self-containment? And, critically, what did I misjudge about them? What makes self-possession particularly potent is that it communicates power without overt assertion. The individual does not need to prove anything. There is no need for grand declarations, dramatic demonstrations, or visible successes. The mere act of living independently, making choices without seeking permission or validation, and remaining emotionally centered sends a clear message This person no longer requires me. They exist fully in their own right. This realization can trigger a mix of fascination, envy, and recalibration in the narcissist. They are drawn to the autonomy they cannot command, recognizing that the discarded individual now operates on a plane of self-sufficiency that they themselves cannot dominate. In this way, self-possession functions almost like a mirror, reflecting both the individual's growth and the narcissist's miscalculation. It is a quiet, undeniable signal that something essential has shifted. Importantly, self-possession also protects the individual from further manipulation. The narcissist may be curious, may attempt subtle testing, or even attempt reconnection, but the centered, grounded son remains firm in their autonomy. This stability is what sustains their growth, prevents regression into old patterns, and ultimately defines the trajectory of the relationship's aftermath. In essence, self-possession is a demonstration of inner mastery. It reveals an independence that cannot be undermined by external influence, a wholeness that the narcissist cannot take away. For the narcissist, encountering such composure and self-containment forces reflection, triggers reevaluation, and challenges the illusions of control they once held. And so, the quiet power of being fully oneself becomes transformative. It is in the act of claiming one's own life, with clarity and composure, that the narcissist is compelled to notice, sometimes for the first time, the depth, resilience, and autonomy of someone they once discarded. This is not a display. It is the essence of self-sovereignty, and it is a force that commands recognition without uttering a single word. It's one of the most powerful triggers that can lead a narcissistic woman to reevaluate someone she has discarded is the visible evidence of growth that is independent of her influence or validation. For a narcissist, relationships are often viewed through a lens of control and utility. People are either extensions of their power or sources of admiration, emotional supply, or influence. Discarded individual demonstrates authentic personal development. It directly challenges the narcissist's assumption that they retain influence or insight over that person. Growth is inherently destabilizing to the narcissistic mindset because it cannot be orchestrated or controlled. When someone changes in ways that reflect resilience, self-awareness, or emotional maturity, it signals a form of autonomy that the narcissist cannot undermine. They may notice that the discarded individual is achieving success, building tenfold connections, or cultivating inner peace. These changes are not simply superficial achievements. They represent a transformation that originates from the person's own choices, discipline, and self-reflection. So, discipline and self-reflection. The narcissist cannot claim credit, cannot manipulate, and cannot predict the next steps. What makes this particularly impactful is the contrast with the past. Tinned the relationship. The narcissist often relied on patterns of reaction, anger, pleading, anxiety, or neediness that reinforced their perception of control. They expected that the discarded individual would remain emotionally tethered, available to react, and easy to manipulate. When growth becomes visible through calm composure, confidence, or social and professional advancement, it disrupts this expectation. The narcissist experiences cognitive dissonance. The person they once discarded is no longer confined to their narrative. They have evolved beyond it. The narcissist's reaction is rarely rooted in genuine admiration. Instead, it is a complex mix of curiosity, intrigue, and subtle envy. They begin to reassess the discarded individual, not in terms of what they can control, but in terms of what has changed, what they might have overlooked, underestimated, or failed to appreciate. This reflection is often silent and internal. At first, manifesting as lingering thoughts, comparison, or even attempts to monitor the person's progress indirectly. The narcissist is compelled to pay attention precisely because the growth signals a shift in the balance of power. The discarded individual is no longer psychologically dependent, and their trajectory can no longer be influenced torrentially. Growth that triggers this reevaluation is authentic rather than performative. Narcissists can detect insincerity. They are attuned to deception and manipulative behavior. If the growth appears contrived or designed to stoke jealousy, it may briefly capture attention, but it lacks the deeper impact. True growth, rooted in self-reflection, resilience, and intentional action is palpable and undeniable. It communicates autonomy, mastery, and self-possession, qualities that the narcissist cannot manufacture or control. Process underscores a broader truth about human psychology. Those who evolve independently of external validation or influence command attention precisely because they defy expectations. Precisely because they defy expectations. Discarded individual, by prioritizing their own development and integrity, becomes a living testament to what is possible outside the narcissist's orbit. His visibility forces the narcissist to confront the reality that the person they once undervalued now exists on a plane they cannot dominate. Ultimately, the evidence of growth serves as both mirror and challenge. It reflects the discarded individual's resilience and capacity for self-determination, while simultaneously challenging the narcissist's assumptions about control, relevance, and power. This dynamic sparks reevaluation because it exposes the gap between the narcissist's perception and reality, a gap that cannot be ignored. In the end, authentic growth is more than personal advancement. It is a form of silent influence. It does not seek to provoke or manipulate, yet it commands acknowledgement. For the narcissist, it is both a revelation and a challenge, a reminder that the person they once discarded has become whole, self-sufficient, and beyond their reach. It is in this undeniable, visible evolution that the narcissist's reassessment begins, and it is a reassessment that is impossible to resist.